Start the
This
broadcast
meeting
and
is
get started.
being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lakelyn Hogan. I'm gerontologist and caregiver advocate with Home Instead Senior Care. If you're just joining us, this is our Alzheimer's live chat. So thank you again for taking time out of your busy day to talk with us about an important topic, Alzheimer's caregiving. Our live chats are brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care, a network of locally owned franchise offices. The Home Instead Senior Care Network offers in-home care with an individualized approach to help keeping your older adult loved ones safe and independent at home. And to learn more, you can visit homeinstead.com. Before we get our chat started here today, we do have just a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are muting your lines, so if you have any background noise in your house or your office, have no fear, we can't hear you on our end. So if the doorbell rings or the dog barks, we can't hear you. Just carry on with your day. We're so glad you've joined us. And then you have the opportunity to ask questions of our live chat guest. So please feel free to type in your question to the Q&A box. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. You can type a question now, or as we get talking, if one comes to mind, please send it in. If you'd like to submit it anonymously, there is an option to do so in the question and answer box, but there is really no such thing as a silly question. We find in our caregiving community that all questions can be helpful to the other people listening. So we encourage you to please ask your questions. And then finally, we are recording today's webinar, so you do not have to take any notes. We're going to email you the recording of this link via the email you used to register for today's live chat. And then we also post it to our helpforalzheimersfamilies.com website. So then you can send it along to maybe another family caregiver that you know who would benefit from the chat. Or if you want to go back and listen to it, you can do so as many times as you'd like. So again, that email should be to you within the next 24 hours. So that takes care of our housekeeping items. So let's move on to today's live chat. The topic of the chat today is a caregiver's personal journey. Each month on these Alzheimer's live chats, we aim to bring you various perspectives on this Alzheimer's caregiving journey. And this month we have the great privilege of hearing from someone, an expert, who has been touched by Alzheimer's disease in her personal caregiving journey. And she's also very dedicated to advocacy for those living with dementia and their care partners. Our guest today is Meryl Comer. Meryl is the president and CEO of the Geoffrey Beene Foundation Alzheimer's Institute. In addition to her role as a long-term family caregiver, we were talking earlier, she said about 22 years of caregiving experience. She's been caring for her husband and her mother, both impacted by Alzheimer's disease. Meryl is a New York Times bestselling author of Slow Dancing with a Stranger and an Emmy award-winning reporter and Alzheimer's advocate. And today we're going to talk with Meryl about her personal caregiving story. She's also going to share some of her lessons learned along the way and tips and advice that she has for other caregivers. And then she's also going to share with us about her advocacy work and how people can use their voice and experience to be an advocate for change. And I want to welcome Meryl. Meryl, thank you so much for coming. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Lakelyn. It's an honor to be with you. I'm a big fan of the services you offer to people in the home. Going back 22 years, I think you were just starting out as Home Instead, and I was struggling at home all alone. So the times have changed, and it's all for the better.
Yes, yeah, we were just talking, you started caregiving about 22 years ago, and Home Instead, pardon me, started about 25 years ago. So yes, it is very timely that we're having this conversation
but if you think
where we are today.
If you think back then, Lakelyn, Alzheimer's was steeped in stigma, so no one talked about it as a disease. So the times are very different now. And that's why I think the opportunities and options families have are really so important. So thank you for what you do in our space.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. And you're doing great work as well, which we're going to hear more about later. But I thought, Meryl, if you wouldn't mind, to kind of get us started, get our audience familiar with your personal story, would you mind sharing a little bit about your caregiving journey and how Alzheimer's has had an impact on your life and the life of your family members?
Sure. I would say to anyone starting out on this journey, you take it one step at a time, but that's only with hindsight. My husband was a physician. Go try to get a doctor to a doctor. He was young. I've seen early onset Alzheimer's. But again, back in those days, they thought it might be depression. I was told to get off my husband's back. Leave him alone. He's just busy. That he might have pernicious anemia because his hair had turned white prematurely, that he might have mad cow's disease. So everyone danced around a diagnosis, which was really very disconcerting back then because I would observe behaviors and then try to take him to a doctor and go try to get a doctor to a doctor. And he was misdiagnosed, Lakelyn, 4 or 5 times. Wow. And usually there's an episode that makes it impossible to ignore the symptoms, and that was the case with my husband. Smart people hide out in this disease for a long time, and part of their brain goes into overdrive, but it also is a very frustrating time, and you're trying to keep things as normal as possible. You don't see yourself as a caregiver. You're a spouse, you're an adult daughter or son, you're a significant other or a friend, and these behaviors are just so atypical of the person you knew. And the real issue is that what's happening is the filters are going down. So behaviors that you used to think were totally, that are inappropriate, begin popping up in a person who never acted that way. And it was very, very challenging because for those of us who have raised children, you know what you do with young children. You take control. With an adult, you are actually negotiating in their space. So for 4 or 5 years, I was trying to persuade my husband, a doctor, to get to a doctor, that there were behaviors that I saw. And once the doctors sat down with him and said, no gross abnormalities, he's fine, give the guy a break, then I was his target. And that made it very, very difficult for me to help my husband. So that's how I ended up calling my book Slow Dancing with a Stranger, because I felt like I was dancing around all the time just to negotiate with him in his space. And I think that's something that you learn over time of how to manage, but it took about 4 or 5 years to get to diagnosis. So that was very challenging. And then when we did get a diagnosis, I was told he was too dangerous to come home and no one would take us. So I left my career in television to figure it out and brought him home. But no facility at that point in time would take him. He was too young, too strong, and too aggressive. And so that's what happened when I brought him home.
Wow, that is quite the journey. We have heard from some other guests on our live chats that the diagnosis process can be really a long part of the initial part of the caregiving journey. Finally getting to, understand what really is happening to my loved one, what's causing this change in behavior. That's usually some of the first symptoms that start to present. And it sounds like it was the case for your husband, that he started acting differently. And so I can only imagine how frustrating that is for the family member, the caregiver, as they're trying to help their loved one through that diagnosis process. So,
well, how many times have those of you who are listening in had the experience where your loved one is acting strangely or inappropriately, and you take them somewhere, and then they seem fine? And people say, what are you talking about? There's no problem at all. And then you get them home and they start misbehaving again. So it's very tricky. But I do suggest that as a doctor's wife, I always respected doctors' time. So I would type out all my observations rather than when I got to the doctor and he said, so what symptoms are you seeing? I literally presented him with a paper, and I also gave my husband the paper because I always treated him as if he was in charge. I wasn't in charge. I was just his assistant. I was his partner. I was not taking control away from him. And they could do what they want with it, but it was my opportunity to get my observations in for the doctor. It was sort of like a cheat sheet for the doctor to begin to ask questions of my husband that I couldn't bring up in front of him. So that was one trick that I used in those early days.
That's a great point. I talk to family caregivers quite frequently about keeping kind of a journal of the symptoms and the times of day, and to bring those along to the doctor's office. And I think you make a very important point by saying, the person is should still be part of the conversation. And I think so often in cases when an individual has cognitive impairment, there is, a tendency to want to speak as if the person's not in the room, or we forget that they can still, a lot of times, contribute to the conversation. They know that these things are happening to them. So eventually, did your husband get to a point when he was able to kind of admit that something wasn't right? Did he, from his perspective, did he know that, he was going through some of these personality type changes, or did it seem pretty normal to him?
I wish that had been the case. My husband, and here's a doctor, was in denial all the way into the disease. Although he took himself off patient care. He was a researcher. He was chief of hematology oncology at NIH. So, he took himself off patient care. He knew something was wrong. And what happens, and this is something else I want to flag, if you're working and your husband is working, people at work thought he was having problems with me at home. At home, I thought he was having problems at work. And we weren't talking to each other. So there was no way to sort of compare notes on what was going on with my husband. Because again, what was going on at work was at work, and what he brought home was what I saw. So for that whole area, I think it gets a little tricky unless you are friendly with those who work with your spouse. And many times that's not the case. You don't typically socialize because your worlds may be slightly different. The other dynamic that is a big issue is if someone is in a position of authority, whether it could be the principal of a school, whether it could be a doctor, whether it could be a lawyer, the infrastructure and the people around them fill in the void just the way I would as a wife. I fill in the right word. I do little things around to keep things normal, which means that someone is getting sicker in place longer, and therefore their insight and their judgment is not as good as it should be. And that's something we really have to pay attention to, because when people are in positions of authority and they're making decisions, it's impacting on lots of people. So it's that idea of hiding out, and people do that for a long time. It can be up to 3 or 4 years when those first early symptoms begin.
Wow. Yeah, that is a good point. I have met, people living with the disease, and oftentimes talk to them about, especially the individuals who maybe develop the disease at a younger age, that it does start to impact their work, and that's one of the first areas that they tend to notice, or the people around them tend to notice. But you make a good point that the family at home may not be noticing things happening, and then the coworkers at work see different things happening, and it's rare that they're coming together to have that conversation. But it's definitely important to recognize that, those conversations, hopefully, as time goes on, can start to happen, especially as that stigma that we talked about at the very beginning starts to hopefully continue to melt away. We've made, I believe, pretty good progress over the last 20-some years. But I'm sure when you first started out on this diagnosis journey, the word Alzheimer's wasn't used very regularly, or there was still quite a bit of stigma attached to that. Meryl, did you find that the stigma hindered your diagnosis process or your initial caregiving years, or does it still impact you today even?
There's no question that it impacted back then. Here I was a reporter. I hadn't even heard the term Alzheimer's until it was handed to me as a diagnosis from my husband. And that was really stigma. The thing that concerns me most today is that we know so much more about diagnosis, but, if we have cancer, 98% of the time a doctor will tell us. But if there's Alzheimer's, 55% of people go undiagnosed. And if there are doctors who are listening, it's a great disservice to families because you have all this frustration and confusion in the household, and you need help. You need to understand what is going on. And if it is disguised or the doctor doesn't say, well, you may be depressed, or you may be this, or you may be that, it is not helpful in the end run, at least with a diagnosis. Then you can say, it's the problem. I have heard many people say to me, Alzheimer's saved my marriage. And what does that mean? The behaviors were difficult to manage. The person wasn't the person I married. Now I understand that it's a disease. It's not my husband, or it's not my wife, or it's not my mother. So I think that value, and also knowing while they have insight, because you want to maintain their independence for as long as possible, but while they have the insight to make plans about their future, understand what their choices are, this is such a critical moment in time for families. And then if you miss it, you're left to make decisions you never wanted to make on your own. So I think this is an area where I feel strongly we really have to encourage and push doctors, don't protect us, just tell us, so that we can then make decisions to protect our families or get the help we need.
That is such a great point, Meryl. I know the diagnosis has been a huge point of conversation. You and I have both been at conferences recently where there's a heavy focus on diagnosis for those reasons that you just mentioned. And we did have a question that came in that I'm going to just pose to you just
Sure.
because it fits in this conversation. But Jessica just typed in and she said, at what age do signs of Alzheimer's usually occur? Can it occur around age 66? So I think, as we continue right now to talk about diagnosis, can you speak a little bit to, the time when signs might occur? I can't remember if you mentioned at what age your husband started to develop signs, but maybe you could share a little more about that if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, Jessica, the signs at 57, you begin to, at any age, quite frankly, but early onset is really prior to 65 years of age. The signs were, here's a man who, his desk was always messy, but he could always pull the paper he wanted out of that pile, and I never touched the pile. It was chaos for him. A man who had driven back and forth the same route for 22 years to the hospital got lost on the way. His personality changed. He got, again, very difficult would storm off. Little things would set him off that would never have bothered him before. So all of these were behaviors that something was going on. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but it was just different. And then it became, so those are the little things. He didn't know where to sign the check when we went out for dinner. Mm-hmm. And we joked about it. I said, maybe you had, too much to drink. But it wasn't. He didn't know where to sign the check. So these are the little things, and you have to sort of, I used to say that my husband's disease, and his name is Harvey, by the way, Harvey became my crossword puzzle. Putting all these little pieces together to see where they fit. What does the picture look like? How can I explain it to a doctor to put it all together? Things that he did well in sports, he could no longer do. He was very athletic. In fact, one of the early things that I did was to prevent sundowning, because confusion gets worse in the late afternoon and evening. I would walk him 6 miles a day just to sort of ameliorate the kind of sundowning that would go on and sort of, tamp down the confusion that he might have. But it is all trial and error, and if something didn't work, I tried something new. So I hope it's helpful to Jessica, but it's not an age. So you pay attention to the behaviors and see how often they repeat themselves. It's not one time. It becomes more of a pattern of behavior than just a single moment in time.
That's a great way to explain it, Meryl. Yeah, Jessica, we hope that is helpful to you in answering your question. And then, we see early onset happening, or younger onset in individuals under the age of 65. But I know that if you look at the numbers across the board, people tend to develop Alzheimer's or dementia at an older age. I guess we've learned over the years that the biggest risk factor for dementia is age, but it certainly can happen younger in life. So Jessica, if you know somebody who is around the age of 66 who is exhibiting some signs of memory loss or the other behavioral symptoms that Meryl had just mentioned, then it certainly would be a time to go and talk to a physician about some of these symptoms that you're witnessing, because it can happen much earlier. Meryl, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the other flag for Jessica and those listening is that earlier tends to be familial. So check if your mother had it, or typically, actually, it's your risk is higher on the maternal side. But if it ran in your mother's side of the family, that might be a sign to pay attention to those behaviors earlier. And early onset right now is running about 5 to 7%. So just as you said, Lakelyn, it's usually when up in the upper ranges. But now as the diagnostics are getting better, they're able to tell much earlier. Typically, by 85, it's 1 out of 2. I also have my mother at home with us, and she had the more classic kind of dementia. About 80, she began showing signs of withdrawing, hiding out, saying she was fine, but I was managing her long distance. And that was tricky because I had my husband at home with immediate needs and trying to manage my mother long distance. But again, much, different in the sense that got quiet, wouldn't be direct. And quite frankly, I was so busy trying to take care of my husband, I was saying, okay, Mom, I'm glad you're fine, but she wasn't fine. And then I had to move in and take over after she reported me to social services.
Oh, dear.
When I had just visited her 2 hours before. So,
Wow. Yes, I meant to.
Nothing should
go ahead.
should surprise anyone. I laugh.
Yes, I did want to.
I don't want
go ahead.
people to understand when I'm laughing. I'm not laughing at your situation, but if you don't laugh and look at some of the ironies and what happens along the way, it really makes it hard to survive. So permit me the laughter.
That is a good point. Laughter does kind of help in some situations and ease some of the tensions. I did want to get to your mother eventually, so I'm glad you had brought her situation up. And I think, again, that kind of shows, Jessica, how the symptoms can look a little different, maybe between the different age groups, or just goes to show that symptoms can start to develop, as young as your husband's age, but in your mother's case as well. So thank you for sharing kind of your backstory and some of your personal experience. So I think if you're okay, Meryl, we'll move to some questions, unless there was anything else you wanted to kind of share with the audience before we take questions.
The only thing I would say, and I can only say this in hindsight, because we all know our experience that we're living in the moment. I used to read everything I could get my hands on, and then I would scare myself about the future, and only half of it ever happened. So, you really have to, take that knowledge, but don't dwell on that because it may not happen. The other point is really cherish small victories. Just getting through a day, to me, was a victory. And little things that you were able to fix or change, that's what I counted. I always looked to find something that made the day positive, quite frankly, because many days were very difficult to get through.
Those are some good thoughts that'll take us right into the questions. Thank you for sharing that, those thoughts with us. Okay, so we are going to start taking people's questions. So if you're listening and have a question for Meryl, Jessica already kicked things off with a great question. So we hope that as you listen to the second half of our hour of the live chat, that you'll take the time to write in a question. There's a question box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type that in at any time. Again, there's no such thing as a silly question, or there's no question that we don't want you to ask, because we know it can help others listening as well. So, all right, we do have a question that came in from Jimmy. Jimmy says, I'm having a difficult time with my wife not knowing me. It's a challenge every night to be able to sleep in bed with her. She still thinks I'm a stranger and wants me to sleep on the couch. Do you have any advice? So, Jimmy, thank you so much for sending this question in. Meryl, do you have any advice for him, or did you have a similar experience with your husband? Was there a point where he no longer recognized you, and how did you deal with that or cope with that?
Jimmy, my heart goes out to you, because I had that experience with my husband, and a couple things that I tried was I reminisced. I had our book when we were married of pictures, and I just sat down on the edge of the bed and began reading a bedtime story, talking about our life together. And if that didn't help and make them comfortable, then I went and slept on the couch, quite frankly. There's only so far that you can go. I wanted to be close because, and I'm sure you feel the same way, if your wife needs something, you want to be there. And it's very hard in the earlier stages because they're getting up and down. Night is day for many Alzheimer's patients. So I wanted to be close to hear my husband if he needed anything. You sleep the way you sleep with the baby, but I would try to talk it through. But if I felt I wasn't getting anywhere, then I just went downstairs, and the next day I tried the process all over again. It is very difficult at night. It's where the confusion gets more difficult. I will say, quite frankly, it was the only time when, after I told my husband the story, he said, "I don't know who you are, and that's not fair to you." And that's the only time my husband acknowledged that this disease was as hard on me as it was on him. And that's the way I took it. There were never any thank yous, but that was the one acknowledgement. So I remember, Jimmy, that experience so well, and you feel very much alone in it, but just take a good comforter and get a pillow. Sometimes I slept on the floor, quite frankly, near the bed and out of the way, so they didn't see. He didn't see me, but just keep trying. And at a certain point, it won't matter. 22 years later, I still sleep next to my husband to feel him move, so I can be responsive to take care of him at night. So things change, nothing stays the same, and wish you the best. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Meryl. Jimmy, we hope that those comments are helpful to you. Thank you so much for writing in with your question. Okay, so we have another one. Deborah writes in, how do I keep my patience? She says, my husband is so sweet, caring, grateful, and my occasional sharp response out of frustration makes us both sad. Luckily, it's only on occasion, but unless I control it, it will only increase as we move farther down this path. We're trying to walk with dignity and grace. Any thoughts for Deborah, Meryl?
Yeah, first I want to give Deborah a hug because the issue of patience, I think it's something that is really self-preservation, quite frankly, around the disease as well. I always took a question that was repeated over and over again and answered it as if it was the first time I'd heard it, because I understood that it was not in my control to change that. And when I would get angry, I felt guilty. I felt very guilty. And I write, actually, in my book one night, I screamed at him. And I realized he was out of control. It wasn't about him. I was really screaming at the disease. And I never screamed at him again. I continue to be sad, and you try to do it with dignity, and you want to have a loved one maintain as much independence as possible, but it is hard. My husband, Deborah, you're lucky. My husband wasn't sweet. He was aggressive and very difficult. And when they're sweet and caring, I'm sure it makes it even harder for you. But I would just try to play it as lightly as you can. It's very, very frustrating. No one who says it isn't hasn't been there. In fact, I was interviewed recently for an article in AARP, and the reporter said to me, he said, the doctors say that when the situation that Deborah described happens, you're supposed to understand that it's the disease, not the person. And every time I ask somebody or interview them about it, they sort of snicker. And I said, of course, it is great advice, but go live it. Go live it 24/7. So, Deborah, you're not alone if that helps. And continue to walk that path with dignity. You'll do it. You'll surprise yourself. So I hope that's helpful.
It sounds like it would be helpful if I were in Deborah's shoes. So thank you so much, Meryl. And it looks like we did pull up the picture right there on the screen, Meryl. I don't know if you can see it on your end, but of you and your husband. So I know we keep referencing him, so we thought the audience would like to see his face and your face as well. Do you want to describe that picture a little bit? I know
Sure.
We had a brief conversation earlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was always trying to read his face, trying to anticipate his need. By the time this photograph was taken, we were about 10 or 12 years into the disease. He became wheelchair bound. I could get him to stand up, but he was wheelchair bound. But if you look at his hand around my wrist, he was still so strong in the disease that if I had moved my hand or tried to get free, he could have broken my wrist or my arm. That's how strong he was. So in those situations, if you ever find yourself in a situation where a loved one has grabbed a hold of you, don't try to pull away. Stay in that position and talk them, distract them, talk them until you begin to feel the grip loosening, and then free yourself. Because the last thing you want to do is get injured in the process of trying to take care of someone you love. And so that to me is a very symbolic picture. It is a loving picture. I was always trying to think about him and care for him the right way, but that grip on my wrist reminds me of all the very hard times that we had. But protect yourself in this space. It's important that the caregiver stay well, and that's why don't be afraid to ask for help. I had problems because my husband was so aggressive that it was difficult to bring someone into the home. But if you need help, you shouldn't be ashamed to ask for it.
I think that's probably some of the best advice we can give caregivers is it's okay to ask for help. I think sometimes it's hard for caregivers, at least the ones I talk to get to that point where they admit that they need help or need that time away. But from caregivers, they talk about how that time away, the extra helping hands can really help them continue on in their caregiving journey. It gives them time to recharge and come back to the situation without burning out. So did you find that to be the case with you? Meryl, I know we've talked a little bit about you've had help in the home at various times. Have you found time away or respite a way for you to kind of continue on? I mean, after 22 years of caregiving, I would hope you've had a little time to yourself, at least here and there.
Well, I still do a 12-hour shift for both my husband and my mother, and they're both total care. And but I've trained everybody. I know what it's like bringing people into the home, and you treat them like family. There's nothing I've asked someone to do they haven't seen me do. And I think it's the spirit with which you bring people into your home and set the pace. I had people who came into my home read letters from my husband's patients thanking him because they didn't know him well. They met him at a different point in time. So I tried to actually lead by example. And everyone who I brought in was treated with the same dignity and care that I gave my husband. Unfortunately, when you have someone who is very aggressive and difficult, I was as protective of the people who came into my home as well. And I told them they came first in my mind, along with my husband. But it's watching how people you bring into the home interact with your loved one. Are they empathetic? Do they touch the person, even in friendship? On the shoulder. What is the dynamic? Pay attention. And I think, well, you do a great job at home instead. But these are the little things you become very sensitive to. But anyone I brought into the home, I trained them myself because I had done it alone for so long, but perhaps I had done it alone too long. And I say to caregivers, we forget who we are. We're so busy putting loved ones ahead of ourselves that we're getting sick. And if we get sick, what's the plan B? So I think it's very important to be open to taking help. I would not have lasted 22 years if I had not done a lot of the caregiving myself. So that's a reality check. But today you have a home instead to look to, and that to me is really a godsend, quite frankly. Yeah. So I'm all for caregivers paying attention.
We actually have a question from what sounds like maybe she is a caregiver. She says, this is Jessica. She says, I also care for a lady with Alzheimer's, and she's so confused that it's very hard to find activities to do with her. Her husband wants me to do things with her, but I cannot find anything that she is interested in. Do you have any ideas? So I guess, Meryl, can you speak from your experience of not only, hiring people to help with your husband and your mom, and maybe experiences you've had trying to find activities that your loved ones want to engage in? Any thoughts there?
Well, it sounds like she's working with a client. I think you really need to know what they love to do, what touched them emotionally, because the reason music therapy is so valuable is because it infuses the brain, but it's attached to emotion. So what did they love to do? And especially in the early days when you're coming into a home, I would find out what they'd love to do. I would actually, find out from the adult child or the spouse, what your loved one liked doing, and play to those things that might have been the most comfortable. Because they may never have drawn, they may never have painted, they may never, you run out of ideas, but you keep trying. But the first thing you tap into is things that used to give them pleasure. Whether it's they liked ball games, and what did they like? And that's where I always start.
Thank you, Meryl. Those are some good suggestions. And Jessica, if you hang with us towards the end of the hour, we'll give some resources, and I can also point you to some various websites where there might be some ideas in addition to what Meryl just shared. I think you're right, Meryl. It's so important to learn kind of their history and backstory, and that's why I always tell family caregivers, you know them the best. So family caregivers are so often, equipped with those pieces of information that can help make those kind of meaningful activities. But if you're a caregiver coming into the home, you kind of have to be a detective and figure out what they used to love doing. What are you mentioned music. Music is a beautiful way to connect with somebody, no matter what stage they are in the disease. So hopefully, Jessica, these are all helpful tips, and I'll share a few more resources in just a few minutes.
The other thing that we used to do is I use photos. When in this terrible storm that we've had that's decimated a good part of Florida, what are people trying to rescue? They're trying to rescue old photos, memories, of what their life was like, things that they've cherished. And to me, photographs are very good triggers. And if you can find out some of the stories behind the photos, then you begin a dialogue by talking to people and talking them through it. And you'd be amazed what it triggers. It may trigger conversation, even though they've been silent for a long time. So again, it's all trial and error, and Jessica shouldn't give up. Never give up.
Thanks, Meryl. All right, Joan just wrote in. She has a question kind of referring back to earlier in our conversation, but Joan is wondering, was there anything in particular that assisted you with easing the aggression, or has time eased it some? Medications, perhaps? So any more thoughts from you, Meryl, on your husband's aggression and how you were able to manage that?
My husband was very aggressive, and when I was told that nobody would take us, and I brought him home, he was sent out to me with 16 Depakote and 4 Ativan a day. 16 Depakote is used for epilepsy and seizures, and of course we know what the Ativan was for. I weaned him off of everything, just slowly over time. And to manage his behaviors and aggression, first of all, I was very careful. I actually put up mirrors so I could see if he was coming up behind me when I was cooking for dinner. So I was aware of his presence so that I could be alert. I put away anything that might be sharp and be misused potentially as a weapon, not intended. You know, I know Kim Campbell, and we often talk about her husband's using the golf clubs and her being fearful that that was a weapon. So things that, you know, are just lying around, pay attention to, and make sure that they're out of the way. What else did I do? Yes, if I found my husband aggressive and angry, I would step out of the room. And I would wait about a minute or so. I could still see him and pay attention to him. And then I'd come back in the room and say, "Hi, honey, I'm home." And pretend that nothing was going on. So trying to diffuse it, but giving it a moment. And then I would come back in again. But again, doctors would say to me, "Well, if he gets too difficult, call 911. Well, no one wants to call 911 on a loved one unless it is an absolute emergency. So I was very careful around the behaviors. I tried to not give him extra drugs at all to manage the behaviors because it made it at some level more difficult for me to physically handle him and take care of him because you don't want them in a stupor at all. So it's very tricky and it's very individual. So I hope that's helpful, but just be careful with behaviors that can turn very quickly. Yeah. Brings back too many memories, and over time it changes. My husband is much more subdued, but there is an energy in the fight or flight, in that aggression, that gives them a strength. I've seen little old ladies hold, 4 orderlies at bay in a hospital because of this fight or flight. So it's an adrenaline rush that you have to, watch out for. But these are the stories caregivers tell to each other, Lakelyn, because we're on the front lines all the time. But it does change over time. It will disappear at some point in time, but at that point in time is probably late stage.
Thanks, Meryl. Those are great suggestions.
Yourself. Yeah.
All right, we have time for about one more question. And Suzanne has written in, she says, "My husband is fixated on romance and sex, she said, with both me and his other caregivers. Any suggestions on how to handle this difficult situation?" And you mentioned, Meryl, Kim Campbell, and in the movie I'll Be Me, I remember that she kind of addressed this situation. And I think for so many caregivers who are the spouse of the person going through the various stages of dementia, can you speak a little bit about the, if you're comfortable, the romance side of things, or any advice for caregivers who are trying to navigate that tricky side of caregiving that no one really wants to talk about because it might be inappropriate to some? Are you comfortable talking about that subject, Meryl?
Sure, if it's helpful. if it is helpful, people, when you're caring for a spouse or a loved one with this disease, romance quickly goes out the door for the person who's doing the caring and trying to make things all right. And it's very tricky. Being close is one thing. If this is hard, and it's so different with other people. You know, one of my ways of bathing my husband was to get in the shower with him. Now, I didn't view that as sexual. I view that as very pragmatic of trying to get him clean. But we were in the shower together. But it was in that environment that I was also accomplishing something with him. I did not have, I was afraid of my husband. So, you know, it wasn't my husband. I'm embarrassed that I can't be more helpful.
That's okay.
I wouldn't talk about it, but it's just very tricky.
It is.
But well, I think would say, let me just say one thing that's very important. You don't want anyone in your house who misinterprets any action by your husband as anything other than here's an individual whose behaviors may be appropriate, but it is not because of him, it's because of the disease. You know, if by example they their hand brushes against a caregiver's breast, if they in fact feel that that is sexual, they should not be in the home. They have to understand that this is disease specific, because you don't want the vulnerability of behaviors being misinterpreted for what they're not. And that to me would be my best advice. As a spouse, you know, you work your way around it and do what you feel is right. But I would just I would say, anyone coming in the home has to understand that this is a disease and not to take it personally. You can't be pinned against a wall, but the kinds of just interaction when you're managing personal care, I will tell you, I often say to my mother, because I need men to help me lift her, now be careful, mother, that could get you in trouble. You know, we'll have a lawsuit if you're not careful. So
sorry to put you on the spot with that.
Your question? No, I don't mind. I want to be helpful if I'm trying to answer a question.
Well, and I think it is so situational when it is, you know, every situation can be so different, and you know, every marriage in and of itself is unique. And then if you were to, you know, have this disease thrown in the mix, you know, it can create a lot of dynamics that are hard to manage. And I'm sure, Suzanne, you might be feeling, you know, you still love your husband and want to be there for him in that way, but you know, it's up to you to kind of navigate that. But I think, Meryl, you made a great point that if there are other caregivers in the home, it's important for them to understand it is the disease, and that, you know, unfortunately, sometimes inappropriate or what would be considered romantic advances can be a symptom of the disease. And so if we need to kind of separate that from when we're thinking about these types of situations. So thank you for that answer. Suzanne, I would encourage you to watch the Glenn Campbell movie, I'll Be Me, because Kim does address that issue kind of with a little humor, but also gives some good advice there too. So perhaps that would be a good movie for you to go out and watch and get some additional insight on. Or Kim, you can
call me personally.
Yeah. Sounds good.
My number.
Okay, well, I again apologize for going down that road, but I think it is a subject that sometimes it's hard to ask about and hard to answer, but I think it's in the caregiving community, we want to support people in a variety of caregiving topics, and maybe we need to have a whole other chat on that for a whole different day. But anyway, we'll move now. Yeah, there we go. We'll move now to the resources that we have for everyone. The first two resources I'm going to let Meryl speak to a little bit. Meryl, would you mind, we're going to flip to the next slide. There's some pictures up here of some great ways that caregivers can get involved in advocacy and kind of navigating the journey. So would you mind telling us a little bit about these resources?
Yes, and they've really come out of my, you know, an experience shared because we say that everyone's journey is unique. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, these are called decision tree tools. And we felt it was important. You know, you feel so alone and isolated that you also want to check yourself. And these are decision tree tools. So the question is it dementia? You know, you see these symptoms, so you can get on and take a 4-minute assessment, and it will create a score that says, you know, perhaps you should talk to the doctor, or this is in a normal range. But it sort of, it validates your experience, and it also says, here's a next action that you might want to take. So, for example, let's do one that we all have. Is it still safe to drive? You know, I had to go in and unplug the battery in my husband's car and then hide it away in the garage. And then he asked for the car for 5 years. And I said, it's in the shop, right, for 5 years until he stopped saying that. But is it still safe to drive? My rule of thumb was that if he endangered others, it was unacceptable, and I couldn't live with that. So anticipate that. So here's one where know when to put the brakes on saying to a loved one, you know, you shouldn't be driving. And by the way, it should be a doctor who tells him. Don't become the target of their ire if you're taking away their car. But here's a decision tree tool. The advantage of these is that families can use them. You know, in families, those who are not on the front lines of care or second guessing what you're doing, make everybody take it. And they're only 4 minutes long, but you know, is it time to get help? That's a good one to use. And also, if you're interested in research, are you right for research? Because you really need a certain type of personality to engage in that space. The A-list, and we have Kim Campbell, and we have Lisa Gibbons, and B. Smith, and this is those of us who say our life experience, we know what we know, and we wanted to help other families, and we wanted to help research. So people step onto the A-list by signing up, and they get to answer surveys, they get to beta test products that are coming online to help us in our space. But we really feel it's a way of getting the pulse of the community. So we all have stories to tell, but this, you know, when you have 6,000 people answering, all of a sudden it's data that's valuable that says, oh, it's not one person's experience, it's our experience. So it's called the A-list, and you sign up. None of our surveys, excuse me, are more than maybe 4 or 5 minutes, taken any time. But there's some interesting topics about experiences with doctors. Lakelyn, you've been very helpful, and Homestead's group has been marvelous in responding to many of these programs. So here are some other dementia resources that are on the screen that you can check. Any advocacy organization really has dementia resources that you ought to check out in your own time.
Meryl, thank you so much for sharing those resources with us. If you want to learn more, those first 2 websites, usagainstalzheimers.org and the same site with the added A-list tools at the end, visit those. Meryl's group has done a great job with creating these resources. There's so many families and people living with the disease can engage in these resources as well and have their voice be shared. If you want to learn more about Meryl, if you want to read her book, Slow Dancing with a Stranger, I actually listened to it, and Meryl's the voice of the audiobook. It's an extraordinary book. It really tells her story and her husband and her mom's story in a beautiful way. If you want to join our community, we have our helpforalzheimersfamilies.com site. You can sign up for our e-newsletter. We send those out weekly, variety of tips and resources. We also have a very active Facebook community, so you can go out there and like us. Remember, For Alzheimer's is the name of the Facebook community. And Jessica, you had talked about activities. We have a great site, Confidence to Care. There's a book, but there's also a free app that coincides with the book, where you can type in activities and it can give you all sorts of suggestions. And then if you're a caregiver out there trying to manage stress, we have caregiverstress.com. If you're looking for respite options so you can get much needed time away or extra helping hands in your house, you can check us out at homeinstead.com. And then the Alzheimer's Association also has resources at alz.org. So those are some resources to leave you with. I do want to mention next month's live chat briefly. On November 13th, with the holidays coming up, it brings about different challenges. And so we are going to talk with David Troxel about caregiving around the holidays and some tips that he'll be sharing with us. So you can register on our website. And if you have any further questions for me or Meryl, you can email us at livechat@homeinstead.com. We can make sure Meryl gets your questions there. So Meryl, thank you so much for joining us. We could have talked for 3 more hours.
Thank you, and I'm signed on to everything that you do. So I find it very helpful, so thank you.
Oh, good. Well, we find your insight to be helpful as well. So I look forward to seeing you again down the road, Meryl, and I look forward to hopefully having all of you on next month's live chat. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.